R. If it's not International Talk Like a Pirate Day, R, and you really like fast hatchbacks, then R only means one of two things: Honda's Civic Type R or Volkswagen's Golf R. Both are range toppers of their respective model lineups, and each has a rich history dating back over 2 decades, and each has an army of adoring die-hard fans. While neither really has the dynamite of the likes of Audi's RS3 or the Mercedes-AMG A45S, either is about the hottest fun you can have under 80k drive away. Deciding which of this pair is the quickest should be fairly easy. However, deciding which one is more fun is going to be a bit trickier. Why? Because despite the various similarities that might cause buyers to cross-shop this pair, there are some distinct differences. For a start, one is front-wheel drive while the other is all-wheel drive. And while one is only available as a conventional manual, the other is a dual-clutch auto only. Regardless, between pace and fun factor, we're going to find out which of these is the hottest hatch.
Of course, if you're spending $73,600 drive away for the Civic, or over $78 grand for our option Golf R, you'll likely use either as a daily driver.
So we're also going to find out which of this pair is the better all-rounder, and to do that, we're going to have to hit the road. So let's hit the black stuff. Chasing cars. Honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
So let's start with a Civic Type R. It fits a 2-litre turbocharged petrol 4, outputting 235 kilowatts and 420 newton meters. So that's 20 newton meters up on the Golf, which might seem like an academic advantage, except for two things. This car fits a conventional 6-speed manual gearbox, generally considered the slower option, and it's just front-wheel drive. And on a back road, it's a real cracker of an engine. Now, there's a really strong mid-range torque hump, and it's complemented by VTEC trickery, which does let the engine rev quite freely, and it's mated to fairly closely stacked ratios in the transmission. That means that in-gear response is excellent, but it also allows a huge amount of flexibility for you to hold gears or to short shift if you feel like it going through the corners. But it's the chassis that's the real cracker. Now, a lot of people have described this as sort of the front-wheel drive answer to Porsche's Cayman GT4, and I must say, I'm kind of inclined to agree. The steering is really accurate, and all the rest of the controls like the gear shift and the pedals are nice and progressive, and things like the clutch and the brake feel nicely weighted. So all up, it feels solid and hardwired, right down to the quality of the snickety little gear shift, and really that's what you want in a dedicated driver's tool. But it's really the dynamic response and the phenomenal grip that you can get from these 265mm Michelins that really sort of underpins this car's on-road talents. And like any true thoroughbred, this car just really gets better and better the harder that you push it. It hooks through corners like it's on rails, however, it's not really the most playful chassis, particularly compared to its predecessor. But the tricky front mechanical LSD really does help to apply quite tremendous corner exit drive. That said, even when you're around 7/10 on a back road punt, it still feels pretty lively and engaging. That's in the dry. However, on a day like today with mixed conditions and you do find a bit of wet driving, you can get 3 gears of wheel spin and a fair bit of an understeer once you start pushing on in corners. And when you do back off, there's nothing really that fierce or punishing about the Type R experience. There's a nice roundness to its edges and plenty of compliance in the adaptively damped suspension. Again, it's very Porsche-like. And probably really the most surprising thing about this car is just when you do dial it right down, how civil this car can be just punting around town and commuting. So despite that torque hump, you can actually tool around at about 1500 RPM and it still remains really tractable and drivable. And despite a bit of tyre rumble, this really is a polite and placid car to drive every day. If you don't mind rowing your own gears in peak hour traffic, the Civic Type R makes a perfectly acceptable daily driver. Right, let's have a crack at its rival from Volkswagen. What strikes you right off the bat with the Golf R is that despite the R for race, it does feel more restrained and less fiery than the Civic. There's just more balance and, dare I say, maturity in its general nature. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's the core attribute as to why the Golf R appeals to such a broad variety of owners. It's softer around the edges, generally more compliant, and simply less highly strung. But this is still a very frisky car and there's plenty of fire in its belly. And there's lots of racy talent to uncork once you really start to dig in. Again, the Golf's 2-litre applies the same 235 kilowatts as the Civic Type R. However, it only comes with 400 Newton meters. The 7-speed DSG dual clutch certainly offers plenty of compensation when it comes to straight line performance. And that's before you take into account the traction benefits that you get from 4-wheel drive, particularly in mixed conditions like we have today. All in all, this powertrain is more linear and probably more clinical than that in the Civic Type R. And if anything, it could probably do with a bit more character. Using the paddle shifters, it nips up and down the ratios without fuss, and it's definitely really in its sweet zone out punting on a back road. Put it into auto mode and it's certainly quite effective, but doesn't really have fine synchronicity between the engine and the transmission calibrations. Even in race mode, sometimes it shifts when you don't quite want it to. And in terms of accuracy from the engine, you do have to use fairly large throttle inputs. It's a great engine, but it could do with a little bit of extra mid-range poke. In fact, that wouldn't be a hard trick for Volkswagen, because the Golf R wagon actually has that extra 20 Newton meters. But ultimately, it really could benefit from that more intimate relationship between the throttle and engine response that you do get from a manual gearbox. However, Volkswagen no longer offers that for Golf R. But these are small grumbles for what really is an absolute cracking performance package. The steering and the chassis is a wonderful pairing. Now, it doesn't quite have the point of the Civic Type R, but the front end is wonderfully fluid. And the new tricky rear differential smarts that you get in this Mark 8 version really bring some proper dividends in mid-quarter balance and corner exit drive. Unlike Golf Rs of the past, you can power out of corners and sort of balance the rear end really beautifully. It's not as planted as a Civic, and it does like to sort of dance and shimmy around in the mid-corner, and a lot of that has to do with this narrow rubber and narrower track widths. There is an argument that the Golf R is the more fun out of these two cars, just purely because it's friskier at speeds that really aren't going to risk your license. Yes, of course, this car gets the famous drift mode, which might be a bit of fun if you want to torch the rear tyres on the open expanse of a skid pan, and the drift mode doesn't really do you many favours out here on a real road. It doesn't really have the grip, pace or direct engagement of the Civic Type R, but that really is only by shades. But that's in the dry. In the wet, the Golf really is the easier car to manhandle and probably makes for a more effective getaway car if that's what you're after. Dial it back and put it in a comfort mode, and the Golf R is downright placid when it comes to touring around on motorways or around town. Again, that Jekyll and Hyde capability of this car has just won over so many fans, but it is lacking a little bit of character. It's a comfortable daily driver, and the comfort and sport modes are really quite resolved and quite usable day to day. However, compared to the straightforward Civic Type R, I've found that this Golf does take a lot of fiddling in its individual mode to get to a combination quite to my liking. Surprisingly, it's not the last word on ride comfort, and even in its softest mode, it can jolt and jar quite a bit across sharp road imperfections. And frankly, what's a bit of a surprise to me is that the ride quality is pretty much equal between these two competitors. But how about the rest of the package? So let's check out their interiors. To date, we've spent a lot of video time and column inches assessing the Mark 8 Golf interior, including the flagship Golf R. The short of it is that it's well packaged, there's plenty of maturity, and there's just enough nicety in here to justify its high $70,000 price tag. Famously, the user interface in here is a polarizing like it or lump it affair, and I'm firmly in the latter camp, especially when it comes to the haptic touch buttons and the HVAC controls. Either way, Volkswagen is looking to address some of the criticisms in an upcoming Mark 8 update, whether people like it or not. But let's move on to the agenda at hand and what it's like as a purist driver's cockpit. It is really very good. The ergonomics in here are good, the steering wheel is fantastic, and I love these petite little pedal shifters. The pedal array is nice, although the brake pedal is a little bit proud, and there is a nice anchor point for your left foot to hold yourself in the heat of the battle. The seats are really good too, with nice chunky bolsters for heaps of lateral support, but they are relaxed enough to be quite comfy on long trips. There's also oodles of electric adjustment for the driver's seat. However, the big letdown for me is that the front passenger seat is fully mechanical, which is a bit of a rub for a car that's over 78 grand drive away. It does include $1,900 worth of glass sunroof, which is only the front half of the car, and is a bit out of place for me for a car that's positioned as R for race. The digital driver's display is really excellent with lots of skins, and you do get a neat head-up display, which are nice features. And while there is a fairly clumsy sub-menu system down here to shuffle through the drive modes, I have found that you can use the little R button on the steering wheel to shortcut, which is really neat. Adjusting the multi-stage adaptive damping though is a bit of a chore and demands a bit of fishing about in the screen, and it is terribly distracting. In terms of practicality, this Mark 8 Golf is very roomy and again well packaged, and there is room enough in here for 5. Add 374 litres of boot space and there really is enough space for most owners' needs. However, if you do need more, Volkswagen does of course offer the Golf R wagon. That wagon option is something that Honda doesn't have an answer for. So speaking of that, let's go check out the Civic. Could the Civic be any more different to the mature restraint of the Golf? I think not. Red front seats, black rear seat, red carpet, black headlining. This cabin really taps the Type R heritage really hard. And it mints a lot of it in this racy suede material rather than the stoic grey leather that you will find in the Golf. It really flaunts the boy and girl racer vibes really hard in here, but it backs it up with a very driver-focused format at the helm. You feel lower slung in here than you do in the Golf, and these seats really weld you into place. It just has a more built-for-action ambience. It's also arguably more action-centric when it comes to the ergonomics, although there is less degree of adjustment in here than you do find in the Golf. But for me, where Honda places the wheel, the gear shifter, and the pedals is nigh on perfect. In terms of user interface, it's simpler and more old school in here than what you find in the Golf, including, thankfully, physical HVAC controls. However, the downside is that some of the stuff in here, like the media system, which is shared right across the Civic range, is a bit low rent for the kind of money that this particular Type R asks for. Clearly, Honda invests where it thinks enthusiast buyers want it, such as this wonderful alloy gear shift knob. And Honda does keep it modest in some other areas, such as the fully mechanical adjustment of the front seats. Room? Well, the current Civic offers a huge amount of room for what is categorically a small car, and that includes much more legroom in the back here than you do find in the Volkswagen. However, it's only 2 seats in the back. And this dedicated 4-seater also gets a pretty generous 410 litres of boot space. Perhaps surprisingly, each of these hatches return around a mid 6-litre consumption out on the open road, and that's pretty handy given the performance on tap. But open up those taps fully and it's pretty easy to see 10 litres per 100 or more.
Given the Golf demands 98 octane fuel and Civic runs on 95, the Honda could prove cheaper on the hip pocket at the fuel bowser.
Other ownership considerations, well, both are covered by 5 years of unlimited kilometre warranty. Servicing wise, Volkswagen offers a 5-year care plan that costs $3,290 with intervals of 12 months or 15,000 kilometres. So that's 75,000 kilometres of coverage. The Honda though has shorter intervals of 12 months and 10,000 kilometres, but each service is capped at $199 a pop. So that's just $995 for the first 5 years and 50,000 kilometres of ownership. Add on-road prices with 5 years of basic servicing, and suddenly the Golf R looks around $7,000 more expensive. When it comes to offering outright pace and fun factor, there really isn't anything under 80k that can really challenge these two cars. Except one. Toyota's excellent GR Corolla is another alternative, but that is a fight for another day. So which is the hotter option? Well, it is the Civic Type R. It's sharper, punchier, and more hard-edged, and it is quicker point to point, at least when the running is dry. And I don't doubt that it would be the more effective tool around a racetrack at 10/10. However, the Golf R is arguably more fun, at least when it comes to punting on back roads. And that's because its dynamic talents and friskiness are a lot more accessible at speeds that won't risk your license. Muddying the waters is that both are hugely enjoyable and satisfying when you're having a hot go. And yet they're so different from one another, including how you drive them. Depending on your taste, you might really prefer Golf's all-pour automatic format over the manual front drive of the Civic, or vice versa, but neither of those are wrong options. Easier to live with and a better all-rounder? Well, I would have bet a house that it would have been the Golf before we set sail on this hot hatch adventure. The Golf is better, but only by shades, and that's because the Civic is surprisingly placid around town and really cooperative for its racy DNA. The manual is really easy to use at low speed. The compliance of the ride is about on par with the Golf, which was the big surprise, and if there's a real down mark, it's just the tyre noise. So ultimately we have a split verdict here. One is the hotter and the other is the nicer, but the gaps between them in those measures are much closer than we were anticipating. So that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.